So, Camille, before we hit record, we were talking about all the things. You are a woman of many talents, but one of the things that I felt really drawn to talk to you about was um, like creating authentic connection with our children. And I know that, at different phases and stages of their development and growth, we have to be a different version of ourselves, right? When they're young, we're just trying to keep them alive, keep them fed, keep them safe. And then they grow up and there's like this disconnect that happens. And I don't know about you, but a lot of my audience always asks me, how do I create connection? And I see the first level of attempted connection is learning how to manage your energy. But to me, connection is a feeling. It is an energy. It's not about time, like specific blocking out time to be with your kids. So I wanted to dive deep today about creating authentic connection with your children, how that might be different than just putting 30 minutes for each child on the calendar a week. And then the pink elephant in the room, because I know I have frustrations with this. I'm always asking myself, my husband and I are having conversations about screen time. This era that we live in of, who are our children? How do they connect in the world offline? So I'm going to give you the microphone. I'm excited to dive into this conversation.
Awesome. Well, thank you. It's great to be here. And I love that your community is all about having real conversation, and I'm here for it. So yeah, I mean, creating connection with children has always been a high priority for me. And I'm a mother of four. My kids' ages are 8, 11, 13, 16. I definitely know how those transitions change from little tiny ones to even school age, elementary school age. They still want to hug you and love you, and they seek for your time. Where then going into junior high school, where there may be a little more search for solitude and resistance and purposeful lengthening of the arm, mom, like stay back. And that's been, it's an interesting transition. And I like that you say that it's a different version of ourselves, because I feel like even with each child, they require different aspects of what we have to give. And it's an ever evolving thing. And so to come here and say, oh, I've had it all figured out, of course I don't. But I do think that there are areas of conversation that would definitely be helpful. So I hope that as you're listening, there are little nuggets that ring true to you, and take what you connect with and leave what you don't. So yeah, I'm excited to get into it.
I always think like storytelling is so powerful because we're all in our own little silos of life thinking we're alone. This is me. But there was something, or we're alone and I'm the only one experiencing this. You were talking about a story about was it your son when he was around 4?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's impactful to share if you want to go into that.
Yes. Okay. So I have a unique perspective of this because I have been creating online business and I am very involved in social media. I started creating online business as a blogger before social media even existed. I feel like I'm a grandma in the space. I always say that when I ever go to like an influencer event or something like that, because I've been around for a while. And I also am very much in that stage of in high school, had a phone that was very limited and, limited text and limited calls. And those limits were put on us because they had to be. It was something where it was extremely expensive. We had limited access, and it was very understood that it was an emergency phone only. Where now, raising kids in today's age, those limits are not put into place by the company. It's quite the opposite. Everything is designed to keep you scrolling, to keep you clicking, to keep you notified, to keep you picking up that phone and connecting with that little device in any hand, whether it's a tablet, a phone, an iPad. So what I have heard coined, and I really appreciate this, I have a friend named Mindy McKnight, and she wrote a book called Raising Kids in a Digital Age. I might be saying that name wrong, but if you look up her name on Amazon, you'll find it. She is the owner of Cute Girls Hairstyle. She's also the founder of Heritage Beauty Products. They are sold at Walmart. They're actually really great. But what I loved that she shared with me is she said, we are the bridge generation. We're the first parents, truly, who are having to figure out these monitoring systems for ourselves, for our family, and putting those safe markers in place and what is fit for you and your family. And that is a very unique responsibility, but it's one that's not going away. But we're the pioneering group for that. And that's a lot of pressure. I feel like, if ever my kids complain about, oh, well, I want this, or I want to do that, or that's not enough time, or whatever, I say, well, someday you're going to be on this side of the table. You're going to be having these conversations. And it's important to put these limitations in place because, I mean, there are a myriad of reasons that we can get into, but it is really interesting to kind of look at that with grace, that we are trying to figure this out for the first time. There is no written rule book that's the same for everyone. And whatever you're trying to do to make it better, it's appreciated, even if your kids don't know it yet. Because I do know that there are teenagers now that are adults who will say, gosh, it was really annoying at the time, but now I get it. Like, these little devices are so addicting. And there's a lot to be learned there. So getting into the story, I have always worked from home as a content creator and as a business owner. And it's such a blessing to be able to do that. And I have always had my kids either, I would work in the morning, nap times, and late at night. Like, that was how I built my business through the years of having all my little babies. And when they got to the point where they weren't napping anymore before they started preschool or kindergarten, there is a window of time that I would let them watch a show. And let's say it was from like 1 to 3, where normally they would be napping, but now this became open free time where they might be on a device or watch a show or something like that. And as you're listening to me, don't think I'm like anti-screen at all. But I did learn that with my third child, who is a son, he had extreme sensitivity to exposure to screens that was nothing like my oldest two. And there was a point where he was about 3 or 4 at the time, and he started to have violent behavior. And when I mean violent, when I say violent, I don't mean like he was attacking me. I mean, he was starting to have outbursts and kicking his legs and almost getting into I don't know if a rage is the right word, but just displaying really angry behavior, internal disruption, to the point of like, what is going on? And he also started to say things like, I just want to die in a hole. And I was like, what? Like, you're 4. Where is this even coming from? And it was very scary to me because these outbursts from my sweet child, who was so young and so tender, the only thing, as I chalked it down and I went through this behavior and the correlation of what was going on in the home, I realized that it was that transition of not sleeping as much, because now he wasn't napping, which is a foundational piece to our health, as we know. And it was also exposure to screens. And so my husband and I sat down and we said, we've got to change something. And we decided to do what we coined as the 30-day screen freeze. And my other kids at this point, if let's say my son was 4, so my older kids were like 7 and 10. And when we said we're doing 30 days, no screens, the only screen we did was a family movie night on Friday night, but otherwise it's nothing. And this meant that for my husband and I too, we had to not totally cut it out, but limit it as well. And it was hard. I know this might sound really strange for some, because some people really do well without screens. And that's not a big deal to like take a break like that. But for us, it was a transition, and it was very upsetting, not only to my 4-year-old, but the older kids as well, that they were just thinking that this was the worst thing in the world. And so in that process, we came up with parameters of what the screen freeze looked like. And we also focused on 5 elements and pillars of health that we went through each day. And I made this up as I went along. And then eventually I turned it into something that I shared. But what I found was, in the first 3 days, if you can get through the first 3 days, that is the most painful time. And it is for the parent too. Listen, it's not like you do this and you're like, this is easy. It really was hard. Like tantrums, the other kids being upset, like, why are we doing this? And this isn't fair and whatever. But after those first 3 days, you started to see the imagination wheels and muscles flexing, and let's think of different ways we can play. Let's get outside more, all of these things. And what I also found is, of course, it's harder when it's winter outside. We live in Utah, and it can be tricky it just takes more effort, right? To go from flipping on a channel or whatever to actually putting in the practice of what am I going to use? How am I going to use my time? And so what we found is after these 30 days, it was this healing that his little body and mind needed. And we did include some therapy as well, a short stint of therapy that was, I think we did, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 sessions. It wasn't a lot. But at the base of everything was that my little man needed to learn the process of understanding and expressing emotion. And so we started practicing. The therapist taught us this very simple way to do this. And it was, today I felt fill in the blank because fill in the blank. And so you'd go through and talk about maybe not even just mad, sad, angry, happy, like the very, very basics, but you could have a printout with like, I don't know if you've ever seen this, but there'll have like, I don't know, 30 different faces with different emotions that you can express.
Yeah.
And so we would start to talk about that. Like, what does it mean to feel overwhelmed? Or what does it mean to feel frustrated? Or what does it mean to feel lonely? Or what does it mean to feel, excited? Really, what is the difference? And what I found was that limiting that screen time and taking more time for that foundational learning of expressing emotion totally turned him around. And it was like we had our little boy back, and he was not expressing and saying those dark, really terrible, sad thoughts, which ever since then, we go through the 5, and I'll tell you what the 5 pillars are because it's very much still a part of our daily life. And that son I'm talking about just turned 11 yesterday. So we're talking, I've been doing this for a really long time. But those 5 are sleep. And none of this will come as a surprise. But we'll say, okay, what are the 5 pillars? How is it going today? Sleep, food. There's so many times my kids go without even just eating. And this goes for my teenagers too. Anyway, that's another conversation. So sleep, food, expressing emotion or communication, limiting screen time, and exercise. Those are the 5. And I think that that's a fundamental 5 for all of us. Those are fundamental health pillars for all of us. And so it was through that I wrote the screen time program. And a lot of parents were resistant to that. Either it brought up shame of like, oh, we're using it too much, or, oh no, we've got this figured out. But in flip side of that, I created a journal called Time for Us, which is purposeful connection and question building with your child so that you can create that clear communication. And that, for me, has paid in dividends with my kids as they've aged and become teenagers, because it's those conversations of little things that seemingly mean nothing to them, or, just little things like whatever it is they find really exciting or intriguing. And then transitioning that into, because you listened then, they know that you're listening now as teenagers. And that really builds a foundation of that care and that open communication.
There's so much goodness in here. Like, I love how you're like the 5 pillars: sleep, food, expressing emotion, communication, limiting screen time, and exercise. And you're like, this is not going to surprise you. 2 things that came up. One is, early on, you talked about boundaries. You talked about imposed boundaries on screens when we were younger because the technology just wasn't there, right? So externally, those boundaries were there. Now it's like an internal boundary, right? Like the responsibility is more on us as the parent. Well, you see that, is it the advancement of technology, or is it, yes, sure, great. This conversation that we're having right now is going to be the same like food conversation, right? That that culturally we're having now. And food came first, screens are going to come next. And it's going to be like, this is toxic. It's just like, like smoking. And, but we're just on the edge of that. And so if we don't like it, if we're like, something's going on here, we have to take ownership and responsibility. And I've heard you talk about that too. Then the other part comes into implementing boundaries. And I'm sure you hear this all the time where people will say, I'm not good at boundaries. I don't like implementing them. And I'm like, yeah, that's where you have to start feeling emotion. And we're co-creating and learning this process with our children. And it's a reset. You're constantly like, oh, there we go. We're slipping again. You're constantly communicating the boundaries. And I know when I'm talking to parents as well, they're like, but Heather, I implement this in my home, but my children go to another home. And I'm like, well, you can
Yes.
only have control over what you have control of. Or they're like, I go to the other home and I know they're free range with screens, and they come back and then I have to deal with the detox of that. So it's not about what would you say to that parent. I want to go into this resistance, because at the core of change, all change, whether it's us seeing a behavior in our children, seeking external supports, and then going, something needs to change. Like secretly, we always know what needs to change. We know that we need, like, okay, this behavior isn't healthy. But the second you're like, hey, like it happens in my house where I'm like, okay, if you're not on the computer or a screen, what are you doing? Like, okay, you're going to school, you're doing this. Like our lives are so compartmentalized, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let's go to that resistance. How maybe do you process resistance when you're like, oh shit, I know we're going to have to do this screen freeze? And how do you deal with that? How do you deal with that if your partner is on board, not on board, has different values, or each child is going to react differently? Another thing I want to say, then I'll be quiet, is it's interesting to have multiple children and to see how like the generations of that, like my oldest is almost 20, the next one is 15, the next one's 12. So like from 20 to 12, that's a huge gap in technology. My oldest will say things about how his younger brothers are parented. And I was like, yeah, things have changed. And he goes, I'm so grateful that you did XYZ. And I'm like, yeah, I could see where I'm slipping because I don't want to deal with the resistance, or I don't want to deal with the backlash, but what you resist will persist and grow bigger. So anything you have to say about that?
Ooh, yeah. I mean, even as you're saying that, even as I'm saying this, I'm like, I need to rein it back in. My youngest has gotten in the habit, or sorry, the same one. He's gotten in the habit of, I'll get ready first thing in the morning so I can have time to play Fortnite with my cousins. He'll get on with his 3 cousins. They're all the same age, which is fun because they're like playing together and he's ready for the day. But I will tell him, I say, I'm okay with you playing a little bit in the morning, but if there's ever fighting that comes from that, then we can't do it. And so a lot of times, if there seems to be a place where it's getting to be a bit too much, I'll say, my 2 younger boys, this is a conversation that happens a lot with them at this stage. And we can talk about the teenagers too, but I'll say something like, it seems like it's getting to be too much. If it gets, I hate fighting and arguing. So unless you two can figure it out of like sharing that 20-minute time or figuring out a way that you can do this together, then we just can't do it. Because if it's going to fighting, then it's just not working. And they'll be like, okay, we'll figure it out. Sometimes I just have to say, yep, we're done. You got to take a break. And we have gone through more than one screen freeze in our lifetimes. I have also taken the phone away from my teenager for more than once because of different issues with texting, or maybe hiding the phone or getting on, or whatever the thing is. So I think that each kid is going to come with a bundle of experiences that you have to navigate. And now where kids are communicating primarily through text, what's appropriate with texting, what's not, how do we talk to each other respectfully? That is such a big conversation now, where before they would just get together more and hang out. And now it's more this texting and it's so much work. So I think number one is that our kids know that the devices are a privilege. They're not owned by them. They're owned by us. We do have safety nets put in place with, restricted websites. I love the service Bark, which will notify you if there is any bullying, suicidal, pornography, language that could be damaging in any way or too violent.
Is that BARK?
BARK. So that's an app that you can use. Another parameter that we love to use is if they want to use computer time, we use the family safety app where they have to request time to be able to play, which I love that because then we can say, okay, well, are your chores done? Have you spent time outside? What is the situation with homework? And we can kind of do a checklist before we even get to the screen time. The one that is tricky for me, and I'm a partner with Nintendo, I work with them a lot actually, their parent controls are hard because so if you have a Nintendo Switch, you can put like a parent control like of so many minutes, but it's just a little beeper that comes up and says, you're over your allotted time. And they just ignore it and it goes away. So that one I don't love so much, but there are parameters that you can put in place. But I think at the end of the day, if your kids have an understanding of why the parameters are important and why you need safety nets, because of what I do and having spent so much time online, I do have a leg up, I would say, than the average parent who doesn't work online or social media and isn't aware of maybe some of the things to be aware of, and not to scare people. That's not the intention, but to say, my teenagers do not have social media. That doesn't mean they haven't snuck it, because you can get on and like Google it if you really want to. And there have been conversations around that. But as my kids have gotten older, we do allow more and more access to social media platforms, knowing that, say, my 16-and-a-half-year-old, in a year and a half's time, he will have to govern himself. Mm-hmm. And so we really tried to have these conversations at the number one, the why behind it. And number two, having open communication about why we are limiting or why we restrict or why we need to put the technology away. And it's an ever moving thing. I don't think you can set it once and be like, hey, we're good forever, because a new game will come in, or maybe it's the holidays, or it's summer, or it's winter, and they're just different seasons. And so that's where I say, have grace with yourself and know that you're going to have these conversations. Part two of your question was, what do we do about a parent going back and forth, or kids between a divorced or a split family? And I can only share with you what I know from a friend who does this extremely well, in my opinion, is she and her partner govern their homes 180 degrees differently, so differently, where hers, they have very set routines of what is allowed with screen time. I think they only allow screen time on Saturdays. And at his home, it's all of the time. And then at her home, they have very set, like she said, systems is what saved her as a single mom. Like, this is the way it's run. And it's very much about somatic healing. And, they do meditation together and they do all of these wonderful things, where at her ex's home, it's not that way at all. And she said that she just had to get to the place of knowing it's going to be a day or two of detox and they're going to be out of whack. And then eventually they'll get back to that Zen or whatever she might say about getting back into the systems. But she said, there's nothing I can do to control what's happening over at that house. I can only control what's happening in mine. And the kids know that we have these charts that we follow with our cleaning lists. We have these routines of how we go to bed. We have these set guidelines for screen time. And it's always a chicken fight, like the first day or two. And that's just the way that it is. And she's had to find peace with that, because really there's no alternative, because it's hard for kids. It's hard to go from one disciplinary or way of doing things into another. There is adjustment that has to happen. There would be for us too, as adults, going from one very extremely different environment to another. So I think just having grace with yourself and with your kids and knowing it's okay. Like, well, this is, if they say, well, this isn't how we do it at so-and-so's house, you just acknowledge that and say, yeah, that is a transition and that's different. And I can see how that would be hard. But this is the way we do things here, and
Yeah.
make it less of a shaming thing and just like, well, that's okay. And we're going to work through it. And this is the way that it is.
That takes a lot of self, I'm going to call it self-respect, and discernment to know, like, this is who I am. This is the boundary I need to hold. I say self and not my children because I
Yeah.
like to observe human behavior. And, when you can't argue with a child. I host retreats and I take everyone's cell phones away. Like, they come on a Friday, they leave on. These are grown ass adults. They have no laptop. I don't even let them have like an Apple Watch, and they're sometimes losing their marbles. If they do it the first time, they're like, oh my God, that was so uncomfortable. And then if they come back, they're like, take it, take it, take it. Like, that was so healing. But it's that resistance at the beginning. And I also see where the connections are, like their fear of not having contact with their family. And I'm like, this is like the high functioning codependency of how we think like the world cannot run without us. And if we are like that, like, we just have to have empathy that, how are we addicted to technology? But most of the time, we're not willing to set any type of boundary because we have to feel our emotional discomfort with that, of whether it's just being projected on us by our children, or we have to have some type of boundary ourselves. So when we're looking at our children going, oh, they won't listen to me, they won't do this, they won't do that. And I'm like, their behavior is speaking, and you have to trust the behavior. But I think they're just teaching us to take our power back. Like, we've given our power away to these devices and screens, which goes back to like saving a lot of time, a lot of energy, right? That we can redirect and reinvest in what really matters most to us. And I feel like you and I could talk forever and ever, because we've been talking a lot about like screens and holding those boundaries, which are a huge challenge for a lot of parents. And we didn't even get into the whole conversation with teenagers, because people will be like, well, they're older. They need it for school. They need this. They're doing
It's their alarm
assignments.
clock. Yeah.
Yes, they're doing assignments at 10 o'clock at night. They're this. And I was like, okay, we'll get a cheap alarm clock, like, do all the things. But it's like holding those boundaries, how uncomfortable we are with them. But what I heard you say is, when you, number one, hold those boundaries, let them feel their big feelings. You're teaching them about feelings, like, yeah, it's okay that you're uncomfortable. Maybe, calling me horrible names is not the way we're going to cope with emotional discomfort. So we're going to learn a new skill. And then beyond that, you're creating connection. And that is true, authentic connection. It's not, sometimes the ultimate connection that we're creating with our children and deep relationship first comes with holding boundaries and letting them feel their feelings, instead of creating this cultural conversation and norm where everyone's dysregulated and they're like, oh, life's just happening to me. I have no control over this. What do you say to that parent that's like, I'm absolutely at a loss. I want the connection. I'm doing all the things. I want this. I want that. How can we make it feel easier? How are we overcomplicating it? What's the first few little steps you would tell them to take?
As you're saying this, I'm thinking about different ages of kids, because I do think that depending on the age of the child, it can determine what that connection can look like. I gave an example of this. I was speaking to someone just yesterday, and I kind of went through each of my kids and talked about their ages and stages and how that can look different. And I think the number one thing is showing up where they are and being willing to invest in their world. Not just in word, but really like try to invest in where they are excited about something. And so an example of that might look like, with my younger children, they make it a lot easier, where I actually have a podcast I just started called 5-Minute Meditations for Kids. This is an interesting one because initially they put up resistance to even listening to my podcast, but when we went through the pandemic, I was Googling 5-minute meditations for kids just because I wanted to create more regulation, as you just talked about, and more awareness of I'm here and I'm present now. And where there are exercises where you can squeeze your arms or your legs or identify things in the room, there are ways that you can be present in that moment and practices you can use. This 5-minute meditation, my kids were like, oh, come on. Like, why do we have to do that? But then I said, hey, it's just 5 minutes, which is the whole reason why I created it. And I made it special for them. So I said, go get your special blankets, go get your favorite Snuggie or whatever, your teddy bear, and I will lay down and I'll do it with you. And then it became something where it was, oh, mom is spending this special time with us. And it became less about like a to-do to, oh, we get to do this together. So that was something that's been really fun. And I haven't done it every night, but when I have, my kids have really enjoyed that. And so that's a resource that you can use. Another thing is for my older kids. Okay, let's take my daughter that's 13. She's huge into skincare. I don't know if any of you have kids, daughters this age, like teenagers, huge into skincare. And she does share casting on Marco Polo. She is on Marco Polo, and she treats it like it's her own social media channel. This is kind of funny because she's not on social media, but I am. I'm like, you're a better influencer than I am, because she'll get on there and like go through each stage of her skincare and talk about it. And she said, Mom, could we do a get ready with me? And so we did a get ready with me that wasn't sent to anyone, but it was just the two of us. And she's like, isn't this fun? And she thought it was so fun. And it was showing up in her world and connecting with her in something that's really important to her right now, or singing karaoke together, or talking about, it doesn't have to be this like magic formula. It's just listening and saying more of the, and oh, tell me more. Like really, that's magic, is just really being there and listening and then showing up where they want to. Where my oldest son, he's like, hey, Mom, I want to play Call of the Wild in your room with you. And would you just watch me? And for him, that's like giving him so much love. That's pouring so much of myself into him, even just being there and watching him play this game. So I think it depends on the kid, but if you were really to sit back and grab a notebook and just pay attention to those, what's the word? It's like a bid for attention or a bid for connection. Mm-hmm. If you really stop and take a look, there are opportunities that are pretty simple that if you really pay attention, you'll find them. It doesn't have to be like a block of time. It's just really being connected to that moment.
Yeah. And it's also about, the connection that we seek from relationships in our lives. Like it doesn't cost money. It's about, is that person present when they're with you, right? Like, are they all there? And I think presence is a practice, and, life can feel full. It can be busy, but most of the time we're just so busy in our mind. And so when your children can force you to learn those skills and to become that. Camille, I feel like we could talk all day about these things. Can you tell everyone where to find you, what you got going on? And if they want to enter your world.
Yeah, I would love that. Thank you. I've loved this conversation, and it's so multi-layered. We really just scratched the surface, but I just want everyone listening to trust your intuition. There is so much within you that will guide you to knowing the right steps to take, and just have grace with yourself. Even as I'm speaking and sharing this, I'm like, ooh, I could really tighten up on this or that, or, oh, I could do that better. Oh, I need to do those meditations again. So you're doing great. That's my number one message. For connecting with me, I am on social media at camillewalker.co. That is also my website, where you can access my coaching programs and also my virtual assistant training. I have a lot of women who want to have flexible working scenarios, whether you're a young mom and wanting to be at home with your kids, or you're a retired person who wants something but doesn't want to be in an office 9 to 5, I have a program I created called 60 Days to VA, which is learning how to be a virtual assistant and developing your own business from the foundation up, how to create a business so that you can use skills that you already have, learn new skills, and help other businesses to offload some of their administrative tasks, social media. But beyond that, a lot of it is about that check and balance for business owners that just need a little extra help. So that's been an awesome resource for a lot of women, and you can connect with me there.
Amazing, amazing. Oh man, the world we live in today is so I mean, there's always the shadows of everything, but there's so much possibility to the point where it's overwhelming. And I just tell people like get super crystal clear on where you want to go, how you want to feel, and just take one little step at a time. And you are a wealth of information. So thank you. Thank you for being here. And we'll have all the show notes on the website as well of everything you shared. So thank you, Camille.
Awesome. Thank you.